Good evening and welcome to the Friends of the Missouri State Archives Thursday Evening Speaker Series. My name is Vicki Myers and I am president of the Friends, and we're responsible for bringing you these monthly programs. For those of you that are here, there's information in the back about the Friends and people that are interested in becoming a member. The website is www.friendsofmsa.org. We invite you to join us again here at the Missouri State Archives on Thursday, March the 20th at 7 p.m. for a program from author and historian Michelle Brooks titled Interesting Women of the Capital City. While most of Jefferson City's history has been told from the perspective of men, Brooks's book of the same name offers a different look, instead focusing on the women who made their own way in the city's first 2 centuries. The 10 featured individuals range from Lydia Montague, who opened the community's first school for African Americans before the end of the Civil War, to the nation's first female news bureau chief, Jarena Giffen, who covered the 1954 Missouri State Penitentiary riot in evening wear. Also recalled is the early suffrage work of Dolly Sheldon, the hotel operations of Emma Matthews, the civil rights leadership of Estella Diggs, and more. So join us as Brooks recounts the lives of these resilient women who made the best of their circumstances and the opportunities afforded them. This program will occur here in person and stream on Facebook Live on Thursday, March the 20th at 7. Tonight we welcome Kevin Smith for a program titled Iron Riders, the story of the 25th Infantry Regiment Bicycle Corps. So what's interesting about this is he and his wife, me and his wife are very good friends, and I didn't realize he was speaking tonight. Growing up in a military family, Smith traveled the world, and it was in this environment where he developed his interest in history. This passion has turned into a career researching and writing interpretive programs on African American history as a Missouri State Parks historic site specialist. Smith is also a life member of the Buffalo Soldiers National Organization, vice president of the Greater Los Angeles Area chapter of the 9th and 10th Horse Cavalry Association, and is involved with the preservation effort of Camp Medco, a fort once inhabited by Buffalo soldiers in Bisbee, Arizona. In his spare time, he enjoys traveling, reading, and spending time with family. So let's welcome Mr. Smith.
Thank you everybody. Can you guys hear me okay? All right, we're gonna have a good time tonight. A little louder, can you hear me good now? All right. Okay, my name is Kevin Smith. Thank you, ma'am, so much. My name is Kevin Smith. I'm a park and site historic specialist for Missouri State Parks. And I'm an interpreter as well. Not sign language interpreter, but I get to talk about history. So yes, today we're gonna talk about the 25th Infantry Bicycle Corps. By a show of hands, how many people have heard of the Buffalo Soldiers? Oh, just about everybody, okay. Show of hands, how many people have heard of the Iron Riders? A lot less. Myself, I originally became aware of this story about 5 years ago when a coworker of mine came across an online blog that was written by a high school teacher in Wyoming. The story made it to our central office. We flew the guy out. He told everybody about it. His name is Mike Higgins, high school teacher. He told everybody about it, and our director just pretty much said, hey, we're doing this, and turned and walked out the room. So that's kind of how we got to this point here. Many have not heard this extraordinary story, and yeah, the high school teacher, Mike Higgins, is the first person to talk about it. So let's continue on with the slides, please. Okay, Iron Riders. Next slide. Okay, there we go. The 25th Infantry Bicycle Corps was formed of members of an all-black regiment stationed in Fort Missoula, Montana. In this slide, we have members of the 25th Infantry Bicycle Corps, or regiment. Okay, who were the Buffalo Soldiers? Buffalo soldiers is a term that refers to African Americans that served in the Western frontier following the Civil War from 1866 to 1951. The Army Reorganization Act of 1866 created 6 black cavalry and infantry regiments that were later combined into 4. So you had the 9th and 10th, which were the horse cavalry, and you had the 24th and 25th, which were the foot soldiers. The 25th is the guys that we're talking about today. Known as the Buffalo Soldiers, either a name that was bestowed upon them by indigenous tribes, because of their hair being curly like a buffalo, because of their skin tone, or because of the buffalo hide coats that they typically wore. Nobody actually knows for sure where this name came from. The one thing that we do know is that the soldiers knew the name was the soldiers knew that the name was one of respect that the Native Americans used for everything when it came to the bison. So if they were calling them the Buffalo Soldiers, they knew that it was a revered animal and a revered name that was well respected by the Native Americans. In this slide here, we have an unknown soldier in 1886 wearing a buffalo hide coat. We also have the emblem of the 10th Cavalry, which with the motto, ready and forward. We also have a painting by artist Bob Van called The Premonition, which I believe captures the respect that the Native Americans had for the African American soldiers. The soldiers literally were just off of slavery, and they were siding with a country that had enslaved them. The Native Americans were like, I can't do that. I respect you for doing it, but I'm not going to do that. So that's kind of the way that I view that situation. Okay. Next slide. With the end of the Civil War in 1865 freeing slaves, many held firm belief or superiority over the newly freed blacks. For example, only white troops could be commissioned as officers in the Army. Many officers flat out refused to lead black troops, or they accepted lower rank to be assigned to all white units. In this slide, we have General George Armstrong Custer, who graduated dead last in his West Point class. He not only refused to lead black troops, he also lobbied President Andrew Johnson for command of an all-white regiment, which was granted. And he opposed the 14th Amendment, which gave the newly freed blacks citizenship. He's a very interesting character. And coincidentally, the group that he that he talked to Andrew Johnson about getting assigned to was the 7th Cavalry. And you know what happened with him with the 7th Cavalry? Not to say that things would have gone differently had he had Buffalo soldiers with him, but he might have thought a little bit differently about attacking a village that size with soldiers that everybody knew had substandard equipment. It was no secret. So we'll never know. I would hope that Custer was that smart, but you'll never know. Next slide. Okay. In this photo here, we have Buffalo soldiers in formation with their horses in 1895. The black units were often issued outdated weapons, aged horses, poor clothing, lower quality food, housing, and pay than their counterparts. They were typically stationed in remote areas, so contacts with settlers was somewhat limited. They were not welcome in the towns that they protected from Native American raids, and they faced overt extreme racism from those they protected as well as from their superiors. These guys had it tough. Oh, sorry. Go back. Go. Okay, there we go. Given all these adversities, the Buffalo soldiers had lower desertion rates, higher re-enlistment rates than their counterparts. They broke up mining disputes. They were the federal law on the Western frontier. They protected wagon trains going west. They ran the nation's first telegraph lines. And they were the country's very first park rangers, Buffalo soldiers. The Army provided an opportunity for blacks to gain employment, pay, and basic education, which was not the case pre-Civil War. In this slide, you have new recruits from the 25th Infantry in Philadelphia in 1864 posing for a photo, the black and white picture. The other picture next to it is a promotional flyer titled, "Come Join Us Brothers," published by the Supervisory Committee of Recruiting Colored Regiments. If you look, it's the exact same picture. All they did was add the little drummer boy, the little flag, the TP in the back, same photo. So they use the photo as propaganda to get more people to join the military. Okay, now that we have discussed a little bit about who the Buffalo Soldiers were and some of the things that they did, let's discuss the 25th Infantry Bicycle Corps. The commanding officer of the 25th Infantry in 1897 was Lieutenant James Moss. James Moss, also a West Point graduate. And like General Custer, he finished dead last in his class. So in West Point terms, he was considered the class GOAT, which is really, really interesting now because GOAT nowadays is an acronym for the greatest of all times. Funny how things kind of flip around, right? At the time of Moss's graduation, assignments were based on your class rank. So with Moss being dead last in his class, that's how he ended up in the middle of nowhere, Montana with a bunch of Buffalo soldiers. That's how that went down. So in this photo here, we have Lieutenant James Moss from 1896, and we have the 25th Infantry in formation in Fort Missoula, Montana in 1896 as well. Okay, Lieutenant Moss was an avid bicycle fan and had the idea of testing bicycles for Army troop movements. It was all his idea. He's out in the middle of nowhere, Montana. It's like, hey, I've got lemons, let me try to make lemonade. So him being a bicycle fan, he's like, let's give this a try. There were several countries that incorporated bicycles into military troop movements. Italy, France, Germany, Switzerland, Spain, England, they all had varied success. There were several disadvantages to using horses as opposed to bicycles. For number one, horses require food, water, shelter. They can be injured, they run off, they have a tendency to be noisy. You have to clean up after them. And the other thing too is each cavalry person or each cavalry soldier was issued 2 horses. So that's a lot of resources going to the soldiers' well-being, the soldiers' movement. So a bicycle seemed like a really logical choice or a really logical substitute to give it an experiment. Okay. Anybody that's been in the Army knows, okay, or the military, the Army approved the formation of the Bicycle Corps, but they provided no funding for equipment. So, Lieutenant Moss contacted the Spalding Company, who agreed to lend the bicycles to the Army in exchange for the use of the Bicycle Corps and promotional materials. This is a Spalding advertisement from February 1897. Spalding may sound familiar. Spalding nowadays makes basketballs. Back in the days, they made bicycles. That bicycle there is an 1897, it's a replica, 1897 Spalding Military Special. That bicycle was literally the Humvee of bicycles in 1897. That was the military grade bike. That's what it was. Okay. The bicycles provided were 1897 Spalding Military Specials. They weighed 32 pounds with no equipment on them. They had a metal seat. Fully equipped with a bed rack, spare parts, and supply container in the frame, the bicycle weighed close to 60 pounds. In this slide here, we have a mannequin with a bicycle on display at the Fort Missoula Museum, Military History Museum. We also have another Spalding bicycle advertisement. We have an image of a bicycle seat, which was called the Christie Saddle. That is the seat that they rode 1,900 miles. Can you imagine how that would feel? It's all metal. Yeah, we'll just leave it at that. Okay. And we also have a specification sheet that Lieutenant Moss requested that the bicycles meet special specifications to be tested in all sorts of terrain as well. And that specification sheet was from Lieutenant Moss. Okay, when Lieutenant Moss asked for volunteers to join the Bicycle Corps, bicycles were relatively a new fad in the 1890s. One soldier, Private John Finley, the only Missouri native, go Missouri, had previously worked for the Imperial Bicycle Works in Chicago, Illinois. So he not only knew how to ride a bicycle, he also knew how to repair one. Finley's experience made him critical to the training and overall success of this experiment. He taught many riders first how to ride and then basic maintenance of their bicycles. The one thing that will stand out about Private John Finley is if you look at his bicycle, he's got a gigantic box on the front of his bicycle. He was the mechanic. He carried all the spare parts, he carried everything. So his bicycle weighed considerably more than everyone else's. In Lieutenant Moss's journal, he writes that a lot of times they were strung out for miles between towns. And so when the bicycle would break down, Private Finley would just ride up, switch bicycles with them, stay there, fix the bicycle, and then catch up with them later on. He was that good of a bicycle rider. Only Missouri native, go Missouri. Okay, the original Bicycle Corps was made up of 8 riders, or 8 volunteers. This group spent the summer of 1896 training with their bicycles, for some, first learning how to ride, then riding for miles at a time, scaling fences up to 8 feet high, riding with no hands while shooting, crossing streams while carrying their bicycles. After several weeks of training, the group went for an overnight ride. This slide shows the original riders that volunteered to be part of this experiment. The asterisk indicates the riders that participated in the 1,900-mile ride later that year. So as you can see, a good group of the first guys that went out were like, yeah, this is great. No KP duty, no messing with the horses, no any of this stuff. They got on these bicycles and were like, forget that. So half of them didn't come back. Well, they didn't sign up for the next trip. Not didn't come back, but they didn't sign up. And they also took William Brown with them because that was their source of entertainment. He was the musician. They had a bugler. He was actually the bugler, but bugle is a musical instrument. I call him a musician. So musician. Okay. All right. There were 2 overnight test rides made prior to the St. Louis trip. The first was a 126-mile round-trip ride to Lake McDonald, Montana. This included 4 days of travel, 3 nights of camping. They had 120 pounds of provisions split between each rider, so roughly 15 pounds of additional weight per bicycle. Each rider carried extra clothing, personal care items, spare bicycle parts, and tools. Camping supplies consisting of a bedroll and a tent were attached to the handlebars, much like the replica bicycle there. The Army stipulated that the riders carry their rifles over their shoulders along with 50 rounds of ammunition in their belt. Because I work for Parks, I can't have either, but I will show you. I've got the ammunition belt and nothing over my shoulders. Okay. So let's see, on this trip, the group encountered heavy rain, having to stop several times to remove caked mud from their chains and tires. Many roads were so rocky that they had to walk for long periods of time. They encountered swarms of mosquitoes, broken pedals, separated chains, separated tires that had to be re-glued due to water exposure because the first rims on the first bicycle were wooden. So every time they encountered water, they separated. Had to stop, re-glue them, wait for the glue to dry, then continue on. I hope they didn't encounter any more moisture. Despite all of this, Moss noted in his journal, quote unquote, the beautiful scenery and excellent fishing made up for the difficult trip, end quote. So no matter what, Moss was like, hey, this is great. So they were just going to continue on. Upon returning to Fort Missoula, Lieutenant Moss considered the trip a success and quickly began planning a second longer trip that took place a few days later. Okay, the second trip was a 650-mile round trip to Yellowstone National Park. The Bicycle Corps departed Fort Missoula in August of 1896. There were 8 riders. This time they were gone for 3.5 weeks. Initial provisions were split between the riders, just like the first ride, roughly 15 pounds per person, and additional supplies were sent ahead by rail to predetermined locations. They could not carry all the food that they needed for 3.5 weeks on a bicycle. That's just what it was. On this trip, they ran out of food between supply stops more than once. One rider, the musician, William Brown, ate wild fruit, became ill, and was transported by train ahead of the rest of the group to Yellowstone. The group averaged roughly 45 miles per day on uneven terrain and made it to Yellowstone in 8.5 days on that bicycle, on that sea. As they made their way through many rural communities, people were surprised to see black soldiers in uniform riding bicycles outfitted with camping gear. Let's hold on for a second. Now, if you were to see 20 African Americans riding bicycles, dressed like I'm dressed, with weapons and camping gear, it'd draw your attention now, wouldn't it? Yeah. So imagine what it was like in 1897. 32 years after the Civil War, the Buffalo Soldiers were in the western frontier. The closer they got to civilization being the gateway city or St. Louis being the gateway to the western frontier, as well as the gateway of civilization going east. So the closer they got to civilization, the closer they were starting to encounter tension type issues. But we'll get to that later. Okay, the group averaged 45 miles per day on uneven terrain. They made it to Yellowstone in 8.5 days. Okay, so we covered that part. Next page. Oh, the really cool thing, let me explain this slide here. I think the coolest thing about this is that these are actual photos that were taken at Yellowstone by Lieutenant James Moss. The best photo that I like of the three of these is the one that's at the bottom, where the riders are actually riding around Old Faithful while it's going off. That's really cool. You can't get that close. Not these days, not nowadays. But yeah, it's literally going off. Okay. I'll draw your attention to okay. People in this country were not ready to see blacks carrying weapons and riding camping gear. The group spent the first few days visiting the sites of Yellowstone, visiting Mammoth Springs and Old Faithful. In this slide, you'll see additional photos of the riders in formation there at the park. This gentleman here on the end with the stripes on his sleeve, his name is Mingo Sanders. I will bring him up again later. He's a very important individual in this story. He's the acting first sergeant of this group. So anyone familiar with the military, you've got the officers and you've got the enlisted. The acting first sergeant is the liaison between the two. You can't just talk to anybody. So he's that guy. Down there towards the end on that bottom photo there, you'll see the big box on the front tire there. That's Private John Finley. That's him with all of his equipment right there. And he's got a pretty cool hat that's flipped up like mine in front. Go Missouri. Okay, next up. Okay, the route Lieutenant Moss chose for the St. Louis ride followed the Northern Pacific Rail line to Billings, Montana, then the Burlington Northern line from Wyoming to Nebraska, then paralleled the Missouri River into St. Louis. This is the actual map that Lieutenant Moss used. Okay, for the St. Louis expedition, 40 men initially volunteered. Lieutenant Moss hand-selected 20 men between the ages of 25 and 39. The Army stipulated that no riders could weigh over 140 pounds or taller than 5 foot 8 inches. We believe this is because they wanted them all to be similar height, similar build, look like government issue. So they were a little bit shorter than me, but about my build. 20 on bicycles with weapons. Okay, so yeah, the riders were roughly my height and my build. Okay, in preparation for the trip, Lieutenant Moss requested several modifications to the bicycles. The wooden rims were upgraded to steel, making the bicycle considerably heavier, closer to 65 pounds. A more comfortable seat was added, the Christie saddle. The rubber chain guard was added for protection of the working components of the bicycle to keep the mud and debris out of all of that stuff. Supply stops were 50 to 120 miles apart. Each man carried the same number of supplies as prior trips, which consisted of extra parts, tools, personal care items, and camping supplies. And that is an image of the replica bicycle as well. Okay, the final list of riders. You have Lieutenant James Moss there in the center. You have Dr. James Kennedy. He was added for medical support. It would have been difficult for these men to get medical care out in the wilderness, as well as the closest they got to civilization, or the closest they got to St. Louis. It was just going to be tough, so it was easier for them to travel with medical personnel. They also had a young journalist Edward Bowes. He's a 19-year-old journalist. His father was like, "What are you doing with your life?" He's like, "I don't know." So he's like, "Well, get out there and ride with those bicycle guys." So the really cool thing about him was he sent regular reports back to his father, who was the editor of the Daily Missoulian newspaper. So everything that his son sent him was making it into the newspaper. So it was being printed. So as the ride was going on, everybody across the country knew what was happening and knew that the 25th was doing it, but they didn't know they were race. We'll get to that later. Okay, you have all the riders by names, as well as you have Acting First Sergeant Mingo Sanders, which we'll talk about the Brownsville incident later when we get to this, towards the end. And I'll go further into that. All right, the first day of the ride, the Daily Missoulian ran this article, and I'll read this here. The start was made from this post this morning at 5:40 when a salute was fired upon their departure. They arrived at Missoula at 6:05 and were cheered by many along the streets as they passed through town. They presented a pleasing picture and their progress watched with interest from one end of the nation to the other. Edward Bowes. That ran in the newspaper the day that the riders took off. For the 125th anniversary, I was actually there. We recreated all of that at 5:40 in the morning. The shot went off, and I'm riding a little blue bicycle with a bell, and it's got a basket on it. Through town for the first 5 miles. We did. Yes, we did. Okay. Let's see. Later the first day, the group encountered heavy rains, having to ride in tall grass to avoid the mud, and still managed to cover 50 miles. In the worst conditions, the group rode along the rail lines, preferring the jolts of the railroad ties to the muds and rocks. As they crossed the Continental Divide, they experienced melting snow at lower elevations, causing the creeks and streams to swell, requiring the soldiers to cross ankle-deep freezing water carrying their bicycles. At a tavern in Big Timber, Montana, a Civil War veteran felt sympathy for him and bought the entire company drinks as a show of appreciation for fellow members of service, regardless of their skin tone. Pretty cool. Okay, on June 25th, 1897, the Bicycle Corps reached the Little Bighorn battlefield. Show of hands, has anybody ever been there? Okay, cool deal. A couple people have been there. Very, very nice. Coincidentally, the 25th Infantry arrived at the battlefield on the 21st anniversary of the Battle of Little Bighorn. Has anyone been? Yes, we already talked about that. The monument of Custer's group was surrounded and is on the hill. The village was near the river, and the description Moss gave in the Los Angeles Times supports the Native American version of the battle the entire time, and I will read it to you. As the evening shadows began to fall, there appeared in the hills in the distance a number of small white tombstones, the silent resting place of Custer's glorious band. Camp was pitched on the banks of the Little Bighorn within a stone's cast of a large wooden cross on which was inscribed, "Here Custer fell." Indeed, the surroundings of our little camp that night were replete with memories most sacred. The whole Corps walked over to this Custer monument, a large piece of pyramid-shaped granite bearing the names of every member of Custer's command. Lieutenant James Moss, Los Angeles Times, November 7th, 1897. Okay, if you've been to Custer's battlefield, you know that the monument is up on the hill, correct? The water is all the way down by the tree line towards the top of that picture there. Now, what Lieutenant Moss says is that camp was pitched on the banks of the Little Bighorn River within a stone's cast of a large wooden cross that said, "Here Custer fell." That coincides with what the Native Americans had said the entire time. When Custer split his forces and tried to flank the village, he came down through the ravine, and once he hit the water, where the women and children were, there were Native Americans there, and they took him out first. He fell in the water and was dragged up the hill to the place where they were surrounded, and they met their demise. That's what happened. He was taken out first. Okay. Oh, yes, so we already talked about that. So when Brave saw him, they shot him off his horse. He fell in the water. His troops became disoriented. They dragged his body to the location of the monument and ultimately where they were surrounded and perished. Okay, 25th Infantry Bicycle Corps departed the next morning and crossed the Little Bighorn River as many as 7 times, twice wading across in low areas. The group was facing a fast approaching storm and eager to get out of the Crow Indian Reservation, which they had been in since Billings, Montana. They were trying to get out of Dodge because there was still a lot of tension in the area, even 21 years after Custer Little Bighorn battlefield, or Little Bighorn battle. Okay, the men arrived at Sheridan, Wyoming, received their rations from the train depot and set up camp. The officers and journalists ate at the Sheridan Inn while the Black Riders ate baked beans and bread outside. The Sheridan Inn was built by the railroad in 1892 and used as a rehearsal area for William Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West show. William Cody also lived at this location for several years, and it's not known if he was actually at the inn when the Buffalo soldiers passed through the area. I was in Sheridan, Wyoming last year for the release of a 40-mile self-driving app tour that I had done for the city of Sheridan, Wyoming. And we were there with the Buffalo Soldiers National President, the Los Angeles chapter president, and many of the other Buffalo soldiers that came in to honor this event in Sheridan, Wyoming. And the really cool thing was that we went into Sheridan, Wyoming, or Sheridan Inn and had drinks at the bar. Really cool. So it was 125 years after the Buffalo soldiers were not allowed to do it. And I was dressed in uniform. Yeah. Next slide. Okay, after leaving Sheridan, the next few days were spent in rain-soaked clothes on impassable roads. On several occasions, the riders were strung out over several miles. They would stop to wait on the last rider prior to entering towns to ride in double column formation. This was a big deal for the Army as they wanted to appear as a functioning military unit and around civilians. At this point, the group had traveled through Wyoming, South Dakota, and were entering Nebraska without improvements in the weather or the roads. On July 4th, the group made it to Crawford, Nebraska, and were met with cheers as they joined the back of the parade riding in double formation. Soldiers from nearby Fort Robinson met the group and assisted with bicycle repairs. As they made their way through the Nebraska plains, temperatures were over 100 degrees, making the handlebars too hot to hold. Several riders, including Lieutenant Moss, consumed contaminated water, having to be left behind and later had to catch up by train. When they reached Alliance, Nebraska, the riders took time to celebrate having ridden 1,000 miles on a fixed gear bicycle. Okay, July 16th, the expedition reached Rouleau, Nebraska, across the Missouri River, Rouleau, Nebraska. They crossed by ferry right there. Edward Bowes sending regular reports to the Daily Missoulian. By this time, the 25th reached Missouri. They were well known across the country, but still not identified by race. This is an actual picture of the bridge, not from 1897, and that is a photo from the newspaper clipping of the men crossing the bridge, or crossing by ferry. And that rail bridge is actually still there. Okay. We have an article from July 17, 1897, published in the Salina Daily Republican Journal, Salina, Kansas, making mention of the 25th Infantry camping near Napier. At 8 o'clock last night, the 25th United States Infantry Bicycle Corps reached this place and went into camp. The Corps crossed the Missouri River from Nebraska, making the 4th state pass-through in a distance of over 1,500 miles. There are only 353 miles by railroad from this place to St. Louis, and it's expected the latter place will be reached a week from today. Okay, when the group reached St. Joseph, Private John Finley, a Missouri native, was permitted to remain in his hometown for a few days and visit his family. Finley being the most experienced on a bicycle, he later caught up to the group with absolutely no problems. Private John Finley, Missouri native. Okay, upon leaving St. Joseph, the group arrived in Cameron, Missouri. Here's an excerpt from the Cameron Daily Observer. I'm gonna read this slide. A novel sight was witnessed in Cameron Sunday. Soldiers, fully armed and equipped for war, riding bicycles. Their arrival here about noon created quite a commotion. They made the park their headquarters and scores went to see them. The soldiers are colored and are in the command of Lieutenant J.A. Moss, a white man who went through here on cars Sunday evening, accompanied by E.H. Bowes, a representative of the Associated Press. The only white man in the crowd in Cameron was Lieutenant J.M. Kennedy, surgeon, Cameron Daily Observer, July 1897. You can imagine the sight. People just started freaking out, like, what in the world is going on here? And yeah, so the really important thing about this, this article mentions that Lieutenant Moss and Bowes passed through the area on a train. They were most likely recovering from contaminated water exposure. While in Missouri, the 25th Infantry camped at Laclede, Macon, Louisiana, which are all considered parts of Little Dixie, Missouri, also known as the Missouri Black Belt. Does anybody know why? Okay, let me ask a better question. What was the main form of transportation back in those days? The river. River towns. Slaves that worked the river towns, fertile soil. That's why it's Missouri, known as the Missouri Black Belt. Folks in that area had very, very strong southern ties. And so, there you have it. Lieutenant Moss later recalled the Missouri portion of the trip as, quote unquote, when away from the railroad, people were inhospitable. In one instance, water for cooking was refused and no reliable information regarding roads was gained. In quote, Lieutenant James A. Moss, Kansas City Journal, July 26, 1897. Now, the really interesting thing about that was where through this whole trip, they had literally ridden, 1,800 miles and nobody knew their race or anything. And then when they hit Missouri and started getting closer to civilization, that's when the race thing started coming up. And then when they got the misdirection and had to purchase water for cooking and drinking, that was in Louisiana, Missouri, which is just north of St. Louis. So they were right on the edge of civilization. The closer they got, the worse things got. But if that's all that they had to do, purchase water and give them misdirection in 1897, that's nothing. That's really nothing. Okay. Upon reaching St. Charles, they were met by local wheelmen from St. Louis, and a mounted police escorted the Forest Park. The expedition ended at Cottage Park, or at the Cottage Restaurant in Forest Park, where Lieutenant Moss gave his final order of the ride. Quote unquote, "Thank you for your fortitude. You will now rest your wheels and fall in for mess." In this slide, we have a sketch from the article from the St. Louis Globe-Democrat, July 25th, 1897, and we have an image of the Cottage Restaurant in Forest Park, which is no longer standing. Okay, that day the regiment was honored with a parade and cheers from thousands in Forest Park, St. Louis. The St. Louis Star called the trip the most marvelous cycling trip in the history of the wheel. Lieutenant Moss considered the trip a success and requested to further test the ride to St. Paul, Minnesota. The request was denied and the soldiers were ordered to return to Missoula by train, arriving August 19, 1897. When the expedition was over, the riders had logged 1,900 miles, traversing a snowstorm, waded across streams, rode on railroad tracks, bad roads, rain, mud, illness, 100-degree temperatures, and had gone through half a dozen broken bicycle frames and 17 separated tires. As typical with military service members, these soldiers were eventually transferred to various locations in the U.S. and overseas to continue their active duty assignments. The soldiers in this little-known expedition will forever be remembered for their contributions and sacrifice to the country and their desire to be recognized as equals. Now, for the 125th anniversary, the Greater Los Angeles Area Chapter of the 9th and 10th Horse Cavalry Association, Missouri State Parks, the Buffalo Soldiers National Museum in Houston, Texas, and Destination Missoula, and a few others hosted a week-long event to commemorate the 125th anniversary of this historic ride. There were presentations, there were demonstrations, there were tours, there was even a community bike ride. I rode the first 5 miles on a bicycle and kind of turned toward the hotel and then met the guy, Eric Cedillo, who was doing the ride like 40-something days later when he got to Missouri. So yeah, I met him when he crossed over from Louisville, Nebraska. Okay, in this slide here, this is a slide of some of the events that have taken place. In the upper left, you have the front page of the Daily Missoulian newspaper. There I am in uniform in that silly little blue bicycle at 5:40 a.m. in the morning. We did it. Below that, you have the riders in the community ride from Missoula, covering the first 5 miles with Eric Cedillo. The guy there in the pink, right here, riding next to me, his name is Paul Renault. That guy's got a real interesting story. He's an Olympian. He ran in the 1984 Olympics against Carl Lewis. I watched him many times while we were at dinner, over and over and over again on YouTube. Just get smoked by Carl Lewis. I watched him so many times, like, I can't believe that's you. But yet, see the track coach up there in Montana, and he came off of the ride. You have Buffalo Soldiers from Los Angeles and Eric Cedillo there in the green in the middle. Bison, there's a photo of us in Wallace, Idaho, when we went up there for the unveiling of the interpretive panel in Wallace, Idaho. They were honored, the Chamber of Commerce in Wallace, Idaho was honoring the Buffalo Soldiers for saving the town from a wildfire in 1910. And they heard that we were going to be in Missoula, Montana, and they sent a charter bus down to pick us up and honored us in Wallace, Idaho. And there I am there giving a presentation in the Military History Museum in Missoula. Let's see, for the Missouri portion of this, Missouri State Parks hosted 4 events that corresponded with the celebration in Montana. We had 4 events across the state, one at Big Lake, one at Pershing Boyhood Home, one in Monroe City, and the final one in Forest Park. We had presentations, demonstrations, there was a lot of cool stuff going on for kids in the community. Let's see, yes, that's the photos from the Big Lake event. We welcomed Eric as he came through. He kept the chronological order with the timeline of the Riders Road, so that was really good. We also had music from the community representatives, food trucks out there, and we had our park rangers out there as well to escort him out through the park. Yes, this is our event in Pershing Boyhood Home. This park here where we had this event is 2 blocks from the General Pershing Boyhood Home. We decided to have the event there for General Pershing's connection to the Buffalo Soldiers. You do know why his nickname is Blackjack Pershing, right? Blackjack Pershing, he was an instructor at West Point, and he would always tell the cadets at West Point, you guys are good, but you'll never be as good as these guys. So the term went from a derogatory term to Blackjack Pershing. You can imagine what the derogatory term was for his liking of the African American soldiers. Leave it at that. So yes, and then we had also military members that came out, and there's James Allen there, the guy that built the bicycles for us, and one of the mannequins, and then our management as well as Eric City. The event in Monroe City was pretty much the same type of thing, which was really interesting because Monroe City is not far from Louisiana, where the original riders 125 years ago had experienced issues. We couldn't necessarily go into their community and say, hey, you guys are getting the wrong direction, get to St. Louis and get a lot of water. So we went to Monroe City. Because when you're doing history, you kind of want to keep it as factual as possible, so we just kind of went away from that altogether. So for the final event in Forest Park, we had Buffalo soldiers from across the country, both Texas and Los Angeles. And this young lady here in the pink is Miss Joan Scott Cruz. She is a direct descendant of the first sergeant who was one of the riders, Mingo Sanders. We tracked her down and flew her out, and coincidentally, Mingo Sanders, well, first off, he was with Teddy Roosevelt, the 1st Cavalry at the Battle of San Juan Hill. Buffalo soldiers made it to the top of the hill first and captured the flag. The flag was taken from him. That historic photo was taken. That photo that was taken at the top of the hill with Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders propelled him into the White House. Shortly after that, Mingo Sanders, Miss Joan Scott Cruz's relative, was stationed in Brownsville, Texas, where the Buffalo soldiers, the 25th Infantry, were there to protect the border. There was a shooting that happened in a bar. The townspeople blamed the African American soldiers. Their commanding officers had gone into the barracks, did a head count, ammo count. Everybody was there, no one had left. The situation turned into a political football, and at this point, Teddy Roosevelt was president. With the stroke of a pen, he kicked out 167 members of the 25th Infantry, including Mingo Sanders, who took part in this bicycle ride and was there at the Battle of San Juan Hill with absolutely no proof. So when we were doing this project, we were looking for relatives, or living relatives of the actual riders, and when we had the list of them, we decided to go with Miss Joan Scott Cruz for Mingo Sanders' story, for that connection. And it wasn't until, coincidentally, President Nixon took office that he pardoned all 167 of those riders, or of those members of the 25th Infantry, but there was only one person alive from that Brownsville incident. He got $25,000. So that's what it is. Okay, next up. Yes, so, really cool. So, right after this, I was on vacation in Arizona with my family over Christmas in 2022. I got a call and said, hey, you want to ride in the Rose Bowl Parade, Tournament of Rose Parade? I'm like, no, I'm on vacation with my family. Well, I probably should have done it because this was the very first time in the 133-year history of the Tournament of Roses Parade that they allowed bicycles in the parade. They've allowed, first time, it was the Buffalo Soldiers, go figure. So yes, those are the other 4 Iron Riders that are reenactors with me. We're the only 5 in the country. A lot of those guys are more mature than I am, 75 plus. So yeah, those guys won't be doing that too much more. But yeah, that was the first time in 133-year history. They've done it in the last 2 years, and it continues to be a thing. If you notice, they're riding in front of the horses, just for that cause there. But the horses are always in the Buffalo Soldiers Parade for the Buffalo Soldiers, but that was the first time bicycles. I also participated in the Disneyland Veterans Ceremony. Shortly after their Rose Bowl Parade thing, they called me and said, hey, you want to do Disney? Disney calls, you go. You know, Disney's a whole different ballgame. So I flew out to California from Arizona and participated in the Disney event honoring the Iron Riders. And it was a really cool event. They had security surrounding the Christmas tree and 2 people assigned to the bicycles the entire time that we were there. Yeah, it was a great experience. They had security walk my wife and son through the whole park. They had cut the line and everything. It was incredible. He still talks about it to this day. All right, so I also have a personal connection to the Buffalo Soldiers. Lieutenant Moss, who was the commanding officer of this bicycle ride, is replaced after the war in the Philippines. He was assigned to the Presidio, Sequoia, and General Grant National Park, or General Grant Parks in California. His replacement was Lieutenant Charles Young. He was a lieutenant at that time. He was colonel shortly after that. But he was lieutenant at that time. He was the 4th African-American graduate of West Point. He graduated, it took him 5 years to graduate because none of his peers would talk to him. And he was actually on the verge of being put out the military and decided that he was going to ride his horse from Wilberforce, Ohio, all the way to the White House to prove that he was still fit. He did it, and so they made him the ambassador to Libya, where he eventually passed away. But yes, the person that got him posthumously promoted to Brigadier General is my aunt, Congresswoman Barbara Lee there in the pink. And she did it in 2010, and it was signed over to law, or he was actually posthumously promoted with the Biden administration when he first took office. There's that cool guy. That's me outside the office. It was about 100 degrees, and I did not want to wear those gloves that day. My hands were sweating big time. But that was the bicycle when we first got it. As you can see, it looks relatively new in that photo, but been through a little bit of weather with me. Are there any questions?